Hi, this is Brisbane Open House Design Talks program. Today's talk is on Australian island architecture, Minjerribah architecture, and the session's being chaired by the amazing Sarah Bryant. Sarah's an architect currently teaching and researching in practice. She's the Director of Quirk Architecture and awarded Brisbane practice. At the Queensland University of Technology, she is the Architecture Area Study Coordinator, Lecturer in Architecture and Creative Industries Faculty Internships Coordinator. She is a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects and Queensland Chapter Education Committee member. Sarah advocates for site-specific, environmentally respectful, flexible and informed design responses. Apologies, Sarah. It's all yours.
Thanks very much, Anne. Good morning, everyone here in the studio and joining us online. Welcome to Minjerribah's Built Culture panel discussion. I'm delighted that you can join the panel and I, for whom Minjerribah, also known as North Stradbroke Island, is a special place. Before we begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, and also acknowledge their elders, both past, present, and emerging. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Sean, welcome. Sean is the director at Sean Lockyer Architects and has over 25 years of international experience. Sean founded Sean Lockyer Architects, an award-winning architectural practice, in 2009. Outside of practice, Sean is recognised for his contribution to architectural education and support of the profession. Paul, welcome. Paul Butterworth is the director at Paul Butterworth Architects and is backed by more than 20 years of design experience. He is very knowledgeable in sustainable design and has ecotourism credentials. Paul is a highly awarded architect, having received multiple industry recognition throughout his career. Welcome, Paul. Welcome also to Justin O'Neill, principal at O'Neill Architecture. Justin founded O'Neill Architecture in 2010, following 17 years as founding partner at Arcfield. He was chair of Brisbane Powerhouse from 2000 to 2014 and is currently precinct architect for this city asset and its surrounds. Justin is a member of the Brisbane City Council's Urban Futures panel and the Australian Institute of Company Directors. He has been Queensland Awards Director and was awarded Life Fellowship of the Australian Institute of Architects in 2019. So welcome to you all. It is often through creative works that we are offered different experiences and encouraged to look at new ways of thinking and being. Architecture gives the opportunity to interpret environments and encourage connection to place. Minjerribah is a particular place, and today's discussion, titled Minjerribah Architecture, Sympathetic Neglect, will discuss a range of topics grouped under some key themes. We importantly acknowledge that we are talking about Quandamooka country, which includes Minjerribah, often referred to as North Stradbroke Island. So to give some context to our discussions today, particularly for our global audience, I'm going to ask Paul to give us some background, some history to the island, the environment, the climate, and what makes it such a special and particular place. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Sarah. Minjerribah is the second largest sand island in the world. It's about 275 square kilometres in size. It's located 30 kilometres due east of Brisbane, which is the capital of Queensland, a state in Australia. It has three main townships. There's Gympie, which is also called Dunwich, Pulan, which is Amity Point, and Minjerribah, Point Lookout. The Indigenous name for Point Lookout, Minjerribah, actually refers to the rock that makes up the headland there, which is the only place that the Straddy stone occurs. The rest is all sand. It is an island destination. The only way to get there is by vehicle ferry or passenger ferry. So everything that goes across there has to be carried on a boat of limited size and capacity. The climate is subtropical, which is characterised by humid, hot and windy summers and dry winters, and very clear winters with very low rainfall. The place is naturally beautiful. It's absolutely incredible. It's crystal clear water, white sandy beaches. The wildlife is plentiful and abundant. You can see family groups of kangaroos, family groups of dolphins, koalas, manta rays. The humpback migration goes right past Point Lookout. And the native flora and fauna is especially unique to that place and that setting. So it is a bit of a hotspot destination for surfing and diving as well, as I'm sure Sean will attest, and fishing and general recreation. It's produced some of the greatest surfers in Australia over time, professional surfers. So it has a real strong active identity as well. The Quandamooka people, I believe, have been continuous residents for tens of thousands of years. Their habitation on Minjerribah is, I believe, one of the earliest recording habitation of Indigenous peoples in Queensland. So it's a particularly significant place. And in 2012, the Quandamooka people were granted a native title over Quandamooka country, which includes Minjerribah, big portions of Moreton Bay, and other Bay Islands, which is an incredibly significant act and has significant impacts for us regarding design, both now and in the future especially. The domestic habitation of residential development on the island, actually, stepping back from that, if I could, Europeans arrived in 1802 with Flinders' arrival, and since that time the island has been home to penal colonies, pilot station, whaling station, leper colony, more recently sand mining, which has been a significant operation for well over 60 years, I think, or more, and has only just wound up at the end of 2019, I believe. They still have a presence there, but their activity has ceased, I understand. So there's a real sense of transition between sand mining and the emerging industries of tourism, and especially cultural tourism, and the identity and the continuing emergence of the Quandamooka people and their craft and other cultural pursuits. The residential development on the island has had a little bit of a checkered history. There are heritage listed buildings, predominantly at Gympie, at Dunwich, and most of the other development there, since the 40s and 50s has really been somewhat haphazard because everything comes across by barge. So structures are predominantly or traditionally been very lightweight and very expedient. The dwellings haven't been particularly large. They've basically been what's necessary to dwell in the bare minimum for short stay or short periods of time. There was more popularity of residential development in the sort of 60s and 70s, but it became apparent, I believe, that things were getting a little bit out of hand, and in the mid-90s, Council developed and created development codes, which then more rigorously governed what kind of development, materiality, and basically created a whole bunch of rules that became relevant for anyone who was looking to build on the island. So at that point, the architecture, which is sort of haphazardly or somewhat organically evolved at that point, people basically did almost whatever they wanted over there. And they were only limited by what they could transport and build physically themselves. Really got reined in, and there were quite prescriptive rules in place, governed by a development application process with the local council, which meant that we could only do certain things. In my view, I think that's been a great move, and has really sort of meant that development on the island has moved forward, albeit very awkwardly, but in the right direction. So it's been quite an evolution. The population is basically 2,500 people permanently, but at peak holiday times, it can swell to 25,000, 30,000 fairly easily. So it is really a recreational tourist destination that is very, very quiet for most of the year, and then at peak holiday periods, it really gets inundated for a very short space of time. So it's a bit of a boom and bust town.
Thanks very much, Paul, for sharing your amazing knowledge about the island, and that gives us really great background for our discussions. And you mentioned that it's a subtropical environment, climate, and that has a great impact on the way that we think about dwelling, think about how we inhabit a site. Sean, what aspects differentiate Minjerribah from other destinations, other tropical and subtropical islands, in your view?
I think what's unique about Minjerribah, and particularly for me, I think coming from South Africa 20 years ago, I think when I first came upon Straddy as I knew it then, but Minjerribah as we more appropriately refer to it now, I think what struck me was how unspoiled it was, and in a world where there's increasing intensity of development and pressure on space, and certainly premium on waterfront land, I think both the cultural significance of the island, the fauna and flora, as Paul quite correctly points out, and I think more recently the sort of spirit of the place, that people that have gone there have sought to kind of protect and to kind of reinforce. I think there's a real sense that, in a sense, this kind of parochialism has almost been its best insurance policy, that it's resisted any form of intense development to the extent where, really other than a few new homes that have been built, of which we've been a part, there's been little to no material change in the nature and intensity of development, certainly over the last 2 decades that I've been going there. I think and even to the extent that locals even almost resist upgrades to roads and things like that, because their desire to want to hold on to the spirit of the place as a place that is unspoiled, that has a sense of being organic, that has a sense of being more about nature than about built form or development, I think really does set it apart from a number of other places. And again, if one, in the context of southeast Queensland and Moreton Bay particularly, I think when you look north and south and one thinks about the Sunshine Coast, particularly for perhaps any international people watching, or south to the Gold Coast, they're both areas of intense multi-residential development and hotels and resorts and houses and canal estates, whereas when one gets to Moreton Bay, there's a totally different spirit of building. And then if Minjerribah has a combination of development and nature, then of course we have Fraser Island and Moreton, which then on the other extreme are almost entirely natural islands with little to no development. But I think it's that sense of it being a place where the minimum amount of intrusion from a built perspective really defines it in a way that both protects it and I think makes it particularly special.
So in relation to consideration of built form, Justin, you mentioned the word frugality, and that's sort of born out of this notion that Paul mentioned earlier about limited access, developing what needs to be developed, spaces that are needed. So the consequential forms are very humble. Justin, how has that historical isolation and associated sort of frugality informed an approach to building on the island?
Well, 50 years ago, there was only sand roads on the island just before 50 years ago. So that idea that Paul talked about the constraints that transport place on you, they're quite real and they're quite extreme. So all of the early white settlements at the Point especially are all generally quite small houses. They're small in scale because the lengths of timber are small. They're running off, everything is just built in sticks and then clad in fibro. So they're all set to the module of those materials. And if you want something larger, you then cluster a number of buildings around in that small scale. And there's a number of examples of that occurs throughout the whole of the island. You brought back before, Paul, talking about that period in the 70s and the 80s where suddenly there ended up being, 3-storey masonry buildings on the island, and that actually, without being checked, it could have gone a totally different way. And I think it's the scale of the island's been preserved by the council checking that from continuing to occur, and then also, because there's only a small amount of lots available on the island, a small amount of area that could be inhabited, because most of it was national park before the native title came in, no one was actually chasing down growth. We had that period where they were going to put the bridge over to the island, remember in the 80s, I think it would have been, and George Nothing Drive is set up as the only 4-lane road on the island because it was going to accept the traffic off the bridge into the Point. But because there wasn't that pressure to grow, the infrastructure stays small. The roads aren't, they're not curbed in general. They're narrow, and so that all supports a predominance of landscape rather than built structure. I drove from Burleigh to Coolangatta on the weekend, and it just really brought it home that just all of that stuff that gets made to support housing, forget about the density of the housing, but the stuff on the ground that gets made to support it. Australia doesn't have that, and immediately has a totally different feel as a result.
Australia also has this amazing crafts-based population of builders, carpenters, who are all, well, a lot of them are really amazing surfers, fishermen. So there's this lovely sort of intrinsic approach to built form, which is relatively recent. Paul, do you want to talk about that and the benefits and potential differences in delivering buildings and design at Minjerribah?
Yeah, I'd love to, and I'm incredibly jealous. Their work-life balance is insane. Look, the local crafts and tradespeople over there are quite unique in my experience. They're incredibly talented. They're incredibly hardworking. Their attention to detail and quality is excellent. Considering the size of the catchment of the population and skills base. A lot of the builders and tradies over there who are operating at the moment had exceptional apprenticeships under really old school quality builders who are still there and still working on the island. We've been fortunate enough, and I know others have as well, to benefit from this skill set and this work ethic from a lot of people over there. So, which means that we've had, exceptional good luck and fortune to get really quality buildings executed and excellent built outcomes for our clients and ourselves. So they take a tremendous pride in their work as well. They're hardworking. Yeah, they've got families there as well. So I think there's a real sense that there's a conscientiousness because they live there as well. Their kids go to school with everyone else. So if their projects went astray in some way, shape or form on their watch, I think they would be particularly conscious of their reputation and the impacts for their family and domestic life on the island as well. I know I'm incredibly conscious of that and being sensitive to the dynamics of procuring work on the island, that we do everything we can to make it as beneficial and enjoyable for everyone as possible, because it is such a special place and no one really is there to see it ruined. And anything that does go astray, heaven forbid, there is a real sense of regret around it should that occur. And, statistically it's probably, it has to occur at some point. The positive out of that is that it's a reminder for everyone how important the conscientiousness is for everybody. But, we've been exceptionally lucky to work with incredibly talented and proactive and conscientious people over there over the years in all trades and skill sets. So it's incredible.
I think if I can add to what Paul is saying, I think that sense of accountability is a really important thing on strategy, not only from our perspective. I consider myself a sort of type B local because I'm in and out as opposed to living there full time. But because the place is small, if you hopped in your car, you could drive every road, certainly at the point within probably 15 minutes. I think you could cover almost every bit of tarmac in about 15 minutes. So, and for people that go there regularly, particularly from a house perspective, it's not uncommon, for us to do a little visit around the streets. So everybody kind of knows everything about what's going on, and all the people doing it know everyone else that's doing everything else. So from a trade and quality and craft culture, there's almost this sort of underlying narrative that something good gets done, it sort of promotes more good things being done. And because not a lot is being done, everything gets its time for people to kind of think about it and consider it, have opinions on it and things like that. And I think you only have to cross the bay to Raby Bay, which is 3 kilometres as the crow flies, and everything's concrete block and massive tiled roofs and sort of project home building, and then you go 3 kilometres away and everything is delicately built with small, simple elements and timber and fibre, as Justin mentioned. And there's this real sense of things needing to respond very directly to a place, and that there is an accountability that if you get it wrong, there's nowhere to hide, and that legacy is going to be there for everyone else to have opinions about. So I know, speaking for myself, every time we're confronted with both the opportunity and the sort of proposition of building, that responsibility of trying to do something that responds to the client's brief, to their own history, to their own narrative, to this cultural position that exists on the island, and then something that is of a scale that is appropriate, that you feel will then generate other good ideas and be a good example to other people, I think is huge. And both Paul and I have been offered opportunities to work on projects where people said, look, we want to knock this one particular building down, and Paul and I both refused because we're both conscious of the fact that you go and do something like this, you will be accountable in a way that you may be not accountable in the city.
Just to add into that, Sean, I think the other amazing thing that's different to the mainland is the collegiate nature of the workers that comes out of that whole process. Like in Brisbane, everyone's just trying to get their own little bit done and damn everyone else, whereas over there, everyone's constantly looking out for one another. So it's a real symbol of what the broader community is like that actually works on building sites, which is really, really very special and very rare.
I was also going to say, just to pick up on a point that Justin was making, just about the context of the development, and I might just get a slide up of the North Lane project. I just want to give the viewers just some context of the houses and the landscape, or the built form in the landscape. But it's essentially, I think, for again, people maybe not familiar with the place, unlike a lot of coastal developments where there's a natural tendency to go and occupy the sand dunes, and arguably the most sort of volatile of the portion of the landscape and the most transient part of the landscape, that temptation has been resisted both through culture, but I think also through subsequent legislation, to the extent where, ironically, Stradio and Minjerribah, which is a beach house location, and it's all about beach houses, overwhelmingly has no houses on the beach. They're all houses predominantly defined by the landscape behind the beach rather than the beach itself. And I think in the slide that the viewers might see, and there's another slide on this context, you can see that the built form really is subservient to the landscape, that one doesn't see 3-story buildings poking out above the trees that are overwhelmingly dominating the landscape. And even in that particular photo, the house that we worked on, which is a long rectangular form towards the middle of that image, is built 2.5 meters below the height limit. So when that was being done, as almost every project that gets done on Stradbroke Island, that house sits on the hill just below where Justin's own house is, where there's a common little viewing area which is shared by a number of houses, because title sort of becomes a blurred thing. People don't build boundary fences. In fact, boundary fences are almost frowned upon to the extent where people sort of borrow the landscape, and rather than defining an edge of their property and then planting a little tree, a big tree remains straddling 2 properties. And the sense then is that the building is very much secondary to the landscape. And in the subsequent slide shown there, even where new building is being built and new landscapes are being developed, the intention is very much for the landscape ultimately to take over the building. And I think to that end, that term that sort of serendipitously came up about sympathetic neglect is really not, it's anything from neglect, but it is everything about sympathy, that sense that the buildings are there to really serve a purpose, to serve a culture, but ultimately, as a built form, it is less about the building and much more about the environment that we're trying to have as the legacy of building in that place.
Thank you all, and that's a really interesting comment, Sean. And we're sort of at the point where we might talk more about this notion of sympathetic neglect, and I just wanted to pick up on Justin's comment about this notion of the built form at Minjerribah compared with the way that we deliver projects on the mainland, and this notion that Minjerribah is very special because you can shed the stress of the mainland, and that journey from Cleveland across is this kind of, we were talking about it earlier, catharsis, and that gives us the opportunity to question briefs, to talk to clients about doing things in a different way, a way that's about the place, and it's about the way they might live there, not necessarily the way they live ordinarily. So this idea of sympathetic neglect, how does that idea, or the idea of the building taking a repose into the landscape generally, how do you talk to people about that, and how does that get delivered in its essence?
I mean, I think it's an ongoing discourse, and I think it's interesting, particularly the more one builds there. I think context becomes more and more important with every project or any engagement on the island, because I think with every good example, it makes getting a better example done easier, and with every bad example, it makes people more nervous of something else. And I think, getting back to what Justin was saying and Paul was saying just about the legacy of the vernacular building being a fibro building with cover battens and of simple construction, a lot of those through complexities of getting to the island, cost of maintenance, people, the amount of time spent there, a lot of those buildings sort of, I say deteriorated, but in a considered way, they were sort of left to deteriorate to a point that they sort of really did the minimum that a building needed to do to really, provide shade, cover, a place where you could lock a surfboard away, throw a towel away when you went back to the mainland. So I think there's a sort of narrative of the building needing to do as little as possible rather than on the mainland where it's trying to do as much as possible. And I think that point of sort of disengaging from the mainland, sort of consciously sort of decoupling with the mainland, hopping on a barge, hopping on a bus or in a car, 4-wheel drive, and getting to the place, there's a very conscious change that goes on, and everyone that goes there comments on it. Some people see it initially as a thing that keeps them away from the island, but ironically it's the thing that ultimately becomes one of the greatest value adds for the island. And I think people then start to think about the building as a continuation of that story of things aging and not being precious, and things, if they get a patina to them, or in the case of, I'm just talking more personally, in our place, we had a natural vine, and I'll get the guys to just bring up a photo of the back of our screen, of the back of our deck at our Stratty Shack. We built a very simple structure on the back of the house, and it's just the next photo. Yep. So this is a picture of the back of our deck, where a native vine has just started growing up the back of the deck, and we didn't intend it, but because you're building into the bush and we don't knock anything down, we don't knock any trees down, the landscape starts to increasingly just take over the building. Now, in Brisbane, we would have trimmed the hedge back and we would have left things to go, in the way that you would typically do them. But in the mainland, the fact that the Moreton Bay fig's roots are starting to affect the drainage, or the vine is starting to creep over the building and, get into windows and stuff, you actually consciously let that happen, because for us and for a lot of people, I think it starts to feel like the story and that conscious decoupling from the city, which is just such a different experience.
So is it more than scale and form? Is it intrinsically about materiality, or is it how's it different?
I think it comes down to community. I mean, the town plan allows us to runs cover for us to have conversations with people about not making things bigger than they need to be, and there's a generally, because it is a little bit more difficult than just driving down a highway to get to the island, there's people that actually make a conscious choice to be there, and then there's generally an appeal to the scale and the way that it's actually, the fabric of the place is actually set up. And then when you're designing houses on sites, because you're actually forced to be a little bit smaller in the way that you actually deal with the footprints, that allows you to think about your neighbour a bit better, and allows you to select views, and allows you to think about the person behind you, and that person's view you can actually protect while still opening others up. And so everyone can start to look after one another a bit. And that's very much embedded in the community feeling of the whole of the island, and it's something that's a really great thing to be able to respond to.
Yeah, I think for me, the conversations with individuals and people who we're working with is really exciting. We're already on an island location that everyone is there to enjoy, and no one wants to see it ruined. Everyone who comes there is essentially forced to decompress and do the time on the barge for 40 minutes from the mainland to the island. You can take a faster boat, but you've still got to sit there for 20 minutes, watching the horizon and the water go past. And I find there's a wonderful decompression that happens, being engaged forcibly with the setting, with the place, with the idea that it is an island. You don't take a tunnel to get there. You don't take a bridge which has solid concrete balustrades, and all of a sudden you pop out the other side into this island location. You're forced to take a completely different mode of transport that someone may not have taken before to get to somewhere completely different. Usually everyone is wearing something different. Everything from their dress, demeanour, how they pack the car, what they're taking, the rituals and habits of life at the other side. All these are wonderful excuses and conversation starters about how to go about design for this particular place. So from my perspective, we've got a golden excuse to fundamentally do something different, to ask completely different questions about what it should be, what it needs to be, to get the most out of the experience of the place, and not to wreck all the qualities that everybody's come there to enjoy, basically, as well as other overlays about, place-sensitive design and being discreet in the setting. having dwellings or development that doesn't dominate landscapes built on ridge lines. So although a lot of the setting over there is somewhat domestic and suburban, funnily enough, in sealed roads, concrete curb and channel, setbacks from the street, we've also got all these other opportunities to start conversations about what dwelling needs to be. The additional overlay of just how much things cost to get over there as well means there's already a sense of austerity, because your money doesn't go as far as it does on the mainland, because everything has to be carried on barges, and there are lengths and load limits and transport and infrastructure costs that impact the cost of building over there, and a number of other things. There isn't a hardware store just up the road if you forget something. You're probably going to dust a day or so backing and forthing to bring what that thing is across. And, it means that everyone has to be a little more switched on and plan a little better about, their comings and goings. So there's just all these wonderful overlays and all these compounding issues and opportunities that I find that just make it such a joy to practice over there and have really interesting conversations with people to unpack, the great opportunities for design. So I feel, and I know a lot of others do as well, incredibly privileged and blessed to be operating in such a place where we have these great opportunities to do something fundamentally different by its very nature.
I think also, the transient nature of particularly Malumbo, the point where the predominant sort of holiday settlement is within the island. I think it does set up a very different language and a very different need of building. And I think, Sarah, we were chatting earlier about the fact that in a lot of the buildings that get done or houses that get done, there's actually a conscious sense that you don't necessarily define a room as a room. You don't go, this is a bedroom. It may be a bedroom, it may be a place where people sleep, but it may also be a sitting room when people aren't sleeping there, or it may be something else. And even spaces that are indoors and outdoors, there's an increased kind of ambiguity about spaces, and because of this need for economy, both by desire and cost, at times, there's a conscious kind of almost deconstruction of the idea of what a house is and sort of putting it back together with essentials. So in certain instances, houses don't have passages between bedrooms. You just walk outside between one room and another room. I mean, the place, my shack, which was originally designed by Donovan Hill, is characterised by the fact that they're within a 140 square metre little building. You need to go inside and outside 3 times to go between the different cells of the building, which touches on Justin's point. So even within newer buildings that are built, they still draw on that narrative of the buildings built 50 years ago, where there's this kind of organic, kind of eclectic evolution of building, where there's a little building and then there's maybe another family member and they sort of tack on a lean-to, and then they need more space for surfboards. That because they happily leave their car outside, but the surfboards need protection. So then there's another little building that deals with that. And then when they have another kid, the surfboards go under the tree and somebody sleeps where the surfboards are. And all the sort of norms that we apply in terms of ceiling heights and things like that, there's almost a conscious sense that all those sort of rules get thrown out the window. We've built new houses on the island where parts of the ceiling height are, the rooms wouldn't even average 2,400 by mainland standards. The rooms aren't even technically deemed habitable. But once again, there's this conscious attempt to go, well, we don't have to play by the rules here. We're doing something completely different. The fact that the room's not defined as habitable is not going to change the way that it's occupied, but it is going to change the way that we build it, and it is going to change the narrative of that home in the context and then what comes beyond that.
Thanks, Sean. And that point about legislation is an interesting one. And I'd like to ask Justin a question about the idea of legislation being able to drive positive change. And, in the future, there's pressure for it to be an increasingly popular tourist destination. So there's pressures on density, there's pressures on development. Justin, how do you think legislation can sort of be a positive instrument and enact change or work with the community to be able to deliver on this sympathetic neglect?
Well, I think we've mentioned it a few times about that controlling the scale of particular parts of buildings. I mean, it's an interesting time at the moment because there's a temporary planning instrument in place on the island at the moment over the lots of areas of Darnetch Amity and at the Point at Minjerribah. It's a really great opportunity as that planning instrument develops, and the way that development will occur in those areas, how the learnings of what the council has already done in starting to make the landscape, in making the landscape have the opportunity to be the dominant factor. I mean, in a lot of what we talk about is a little bit romantic because in some places, even with the town planning instruments as they work at the moment, you still get a lot of construction above the tree line along the ridges and the like. There's some really sensitive areas that are touched by that planning instrument, and it would be interesting to see what different titling options we could put over those, especially the ones going all the way down along Main Beach, and how you might actually set it up so that the landscape became the primary factor and the houses were second, and then what comes out of that. So hopefully the state is thinking about those things and working on models that might actually be of benefit rather than it being something that might be of detriment.
I think there are going to be some, as Justin quite correctly says, I think there are a lot of tensions, I think not only with building in an environment like that, but I think also in the sort of transition from the sand mining to what is intended and sort of earmarked to be eco-tourism on the island. I certainly talking to colleagues and residents on the island, friends on the island and stuff, I don't think anyone really has an idea how the rubber sort of hits the road with all of that, because I think that generalising too much, all of us, even as kind of part-time residents, there, people invested in the island, there's a natural tendency for all of us to want to resist change of any description, of any material change. And part of that, Paul flagged the fact that the place goes for roughly 2,500 people, I think it is, to about 25,000, 30,000 people over December. And the nature of the place changes completely, and everything, kind of just survives. But, it survives because they go away again after 2 or 3 weeks, and then you've got, the other 49 odd weeks in the year where, there are very few people there. And I think as one tries to encourage tourism, there's this tension between it being sort of low volume, high value tourism, that people can go there and kind of enjoy the environment, and from a commercial sense that they can, invest money in the place, enjoy the place, leave a very small footprint and sort of be on their way again. And there've been some newspaper articles about fast ferries and stuff from the city, taking, I think they were talking about thousands of people a day to the island, which again, how resolved those ideas are, I don't know. But the resources and the sort of infrastructure on the island's not there to support those things yet. And I dare say, and again, I don't want to presume for anybody else, if all of a sudden, we got a letter as ratepayers on the island that they were putting on another 40 buses, or that they're putting in a bus terminal at the Point, or they're putting in a train or something like that to deal with it. It's not something that's going to go down very well by anybody. There's nobody that wants that. So I think both in terms of the building and also this transition in terms of its use, I think there's a great deal of uncertainty of what that actually will look like. And I don't know that anybody has a very clear idea about how it can be done sustainably in a way that it does fill some of that financial gap that has been naturally created by the absence of the mining.
How then does the community, and it's a very engaged, active community supported by very passionate designers, how do they then be able to have a strong enough voice in this process to be able to continue to support the notion about the particular place and good design principles, based on an idea of sympathetic neglect, or an idea of what's what's truly appropriate for Minjerribah?
Yeah. Although the community, and especially the permanent resident community, is modestly scaled, they are incredibly passionate and incredibly vocal, in my experience. If something has been afoot that has not been particularly palatable to the community, they certainly haven't been backwards in voicing their concern, petitioning the authorities, and generally rallying for all sorts of different causes over time, be it from the plans to bridge Moreton Bay to issues around wildlife and cultural heritage as well. I have every confidence that they will certainly continue to do that and marshal their forces and their few but vocal voices, and petition the governments and engage with the media and themselves, and certainly get a grip of social media, voice their concerns and hopefully have influence. I know there have been many plans afoot and continue to at the moment that are particularly hot topics over there that I won't go into particularly, but I have every faith that the community has no trouble being heard. However, the results always remain to be seen.
I mean, it's the Quandamooka community's call too. It's their land, so I think I just think it's pretty hopeful that it's a really good opportunity. I think that it's more that will the state probably allow the Government Architect's Office to actually have enough of a say in studying the outcomes of what might happen, and then speak to the local landowners as to how that impacts on what their vision for the place is, and to come up with a original solution that fits the ethos of the island. And you'd have to say that there's not too many difficult steps in actually doing that. There just needs to be some desire.
I think we could be talking about this. We could have this conversation well into the afternoon. We've just got a few minutes left, so I just wanted to hand it back to all of you just to give a sort of a final comment about the work that you've done there. We can see your passion for the place. Sean, I think you're going over there in about an hour's time. So it's been
155 barge.
Thank you for the wonderful conversation. I can see that it's a very particular place, and you've done some amazing work over there, and will continue to do so. So in wrapping up, what would your advice be to the audience, or what would be your kind of final comments in relation to being able to support such a wonderful place going forward?
I think for myself, I just want to learn more about the culture. I want to learn more about the traditional owners. I want to understand more about the fauna and flora, and try and find a way that we can do less and less, genuinely do less and less, to achieve the outcomes and all the sort of cultural, spiritual and aspirational things that people want from the place. And we've just got to keep fighting to preserve it.
I'm really conscious that we're just visitors to the island, and that the local community is incredibly strong, and it's the heart and soul of the place, and it is somewhat at one with the landscape in a way. And I think just if everyone keeps protecting that, then the soul will stay there.
Yeah, I definitely have to agree in both cases, and I feel that our practice's progression over there is certainly in its infancy, and there's a lot to learn and a lot to unpack in our future, and we'll just keep marching forward as well we can, project by project, trying to do our best and trying to learn as much as possible from the place and others who have been there for a heck of a lot longer. And basically just do our best and defer to the raw beauty and power of the place as much as we possibly can with as modest a means as possible. That's all we can do.
And I think what's lovely about that ethos is that there's this amazing transference of we arrive, but then we go back to our other places, and we can apply that amazing sense of place and those principles that are unique to a truly successful collaboration. So thank you all for a wonderful discussion, and I'll look forward to seeing you on one of the beaches at Minjerribah very soon.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah.
A pleasure.
Hello and welcome to Brisbane Open House Design Talks for 2020. This is our lovely talk about loving your local heritage. This talk is chaired by the amazing Loretta Ryan. With over 30 years experience in the media industry, ABC Radio Breakfast is in very safe hands with Loretta Ryan and her co-host Craig Zonka. Loretta grew up in Brisbane and started in radio at the age of 17, and her experience in media also extends to television presenting and reporting. A passionate Queenslander and a rugby league tragic and a former aerobics instructor, Loretta can't wait to spend her weekday breakfasts with you. It's all yours.
Thank you. I thought you were going to say I can't wait to do some aerobics, but I'm not going to be doing that today. It's lovely to be here, and I can't wait for the conversation today because we all love to find out about our local heritage, where we've come from, where we're going maybe in the future. It's a final panel discussion too for Brisbane Open House, this speaker series, which has been just wonderful to listen to and to watch. So I hope you've been enjoying it. We will be looking at heritage today from 4 different viewpoints and exploring the Aboriginal knowledge of the places that make up the fabric of our daily lives. Before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place and acknowledge their elders both past, present and emerging. Now I would like to introduce you to our panel of wonderful speakers here today. First up, we have Cameron Harvey. Cameron is the Queensland Regional Manager of Niche Environment and Heritage. He is an experienced cultural heritage professional with a background in historical archaeology and non-Indigenous cultural heritage management in Queensland, having worked in these fields for over 20 years. Next, we have Minjerribah Bales. She has more than 18 years' experience working for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous organisations in New South Wales and Queensland. Minjerribah is the Managing Director and Co-Founder of the Australian Black Card Proprietary Limited, which is a 100% Aboriginal-owned and operated business that provides cultural knowledge, training and tours. And she is also the host of Black Magic Woman podcast. Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Margaret Cook. Dr. Cook is a history lecturer at the University of Sunshine Coast and holds honorary research fellow positions at La Trobe University and the University of Queensland. She has been a freelance historian for many years, working in the heritage, museum, government and private sectors and publishing on numerous topics. And finally, I would like to introduce Tom Blake. Tom is a heritage consultant and professional historian. He has extensive experience in undertaking cultural heritage projects in Queensland, including conservation management plans, regional and local surveys, statewide surveys, thematic studies and heritage impact statements. Welcome everyone. And we were talking a little bit before about historians and archaeologists and how they see the world. How do you see the world? Come on, do you all get on? Who's going to answer for me? Cameron?
Yes, we do. But I think historians and archaeologists, we often investigate the same things, but we often use different tools. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the same tools, sometimes different tools as well. But we certainly do get on the whole.
On the whole, Margaret, yes.
I agree. I think we also ask different questions And I think when we get the different disciplines together, that's when the synergy and the exciting things happen, where we challenge each other and can try and solve bigger issues than just the one we're looking at.
Well, the questions are important, aren't they? When you say you ask different questions, how different are they?
Well, we look above the ground. Should I have that the facetious answer? But go on.
And we look below as well. Questions, so many questions. Everything that we do is driven by questions. So otherwise it just becomes another activity.
Yeah.
The whole point of doing archaeology or history is to learn something new, to try and understand our past a bit better, to understand ourselves a little bit better, and understand the things that we've done in the past to help us inform about what our future might be like as well.
Tom, do we always find the answers?
No, I kind of beg to disagree a little,
oh,
actually.
okay.
Yeah.
See, I love this.
Because to me, if I'm investigating, say, a building, clearly you're going to look at the written documents, but to me, the building itself, the stuff, is just as important. And as a historian, I think it's important that you develop those skills to interrogate stuff as much as it is to go to the archives. So I don't. To me, it sort of really meshes together, and I think I don't like those sort of artificial divisions. I mean, there are good archaeologists that are also good historians. There are good historians that are good archaeologists, and vice versa. Where it doesn't work, So I kind of. Think one needs to keep your eyes open and develop a range of skills, and there's plenty of examples where those two things just sort of flow together.
Yeah, it's all about curiosity, isn't there? Isn't it?
Absolutely.
And Minjerribah, there's been some growth in the curiosity, of course, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture in recent years. These stories are embedded in the land. I suppose there are some gaps too, and people aren't understanding. How do we make them understand? How do we find the information?
That's a big question. How do we make people understand? Well, I guess going back to being curious about our history, being curious about what we have around us, why things are the way they are, why are we the way we are. I would say that, from my perspective as an Aboriginal person, every man and his dog has had a chance at describing us as Aboriginal people, right? For a long time, we're seen as the missing link between animal and mankind, which is quite strange to me. In terms of Aboriginal people now today, we're describing ourselves for the very first time in our whole history, and I think that's what's really important, that it's not an anthropologist, an archaeologist, a sociolinguist like Lieberman or Tyndale, trying to describe us and tell us who we are, where we come from. So what I would say is that the more that Aboriginal people, describe ourselves to people, we're letting people into our culture, we're letting people in to understand our experience, because it's been very different to a lot of non-Aboriginal people in this country. So I think it's really powerful that Aboriginal people are in a position now to describe ourselves to the rest of the world, which means we're actually having conversations with people, whereas 20, 30 years ago, we wouldn't have been having those conversations with people. Yeah. I wouldn't be doing business, I wouldn't have made it in business because a lot of people weren't really interested in Aboriginal culture. There's a whole negative connotation to the word Aboriginal. So a lot of people don't even like the term Aboriginal. So I would just say that how do we get people curious about our history in this country? People like Bruce Pascoe, he's written that amazing book, Dark Emu. A journalist like Stan Grant did that documentary called The Australian Dream. So the more and more Aboriginal people are telling our stories, I think the more and more curious people get to go, hold a minute, what we've learnt, most of what we've learnt about Aboriginal people is actually incorrect.
And is there, you don't want to lay the blame, but going back, I know to my schooling, in primary school, we certainly didn't learn a lot. You'd do a project and you didn't learn, and you wonder why that is, and you feel guilty for not knowing more or not being taught, but where does the blame lie?
Well, I don't think it's about blame. What I think, to be honest with you, if we start talking about blame and guilt, then we're kind of starting from a negative standpoint or a negative view. I always say to people, it's about drawing from our strengths, not from our weaknesses. So where are we today? I think we're in a position, especially here in Queensland. We've got the Queensland Teachers Union for the very first time offering professional development to 50,000 members to be culturally capable. That's never happened. We've got educators now for the very first time that are actually, they've got a toolkit, they're educated, they've got knowledge, and they can give justice to a lesson plan where it's about embedding an Indigenous knowledge or perspective into the curriculum. So I would say that Queensland's doing a really good job first at educating educators. So even though it was left out of a lot of people's education, educators, I don't think they should get the blame either. That they don't feel confident teaching an Indigenous perspective in a lesson plan because they don't know.
No, it wasn't done.
Is this right or wrong? Who wrote this? A lot of the literature, when you think about it, about Aboriginal people, culture, history, philosophy, about 90% is written by non-Aboriginal people. So what's true, what's not true?
Yeah.
I don't know. I just think that the more and more we have these conversations and people start to become more curious.
Tom, local heritage is often overlooked, undervalued as well. Very different, I guess, to what we would expect. As a historian with considerable experience in locating, I suppose, a lot of stories of the past, which we love to hear about, I know I do. Give us an example you want to tell us about.
Okay. Well,
I know you've got plenty.
I've got
Pick
plenty.
your best one.
And I think just getting back to your thing about curiosity, that is so important. And in a sense, every day there are things before us that if we become aware of them, can just open our eyes to a whole different world in this city. Well, let me give you an example of a house at Manly. It just is so average. You wouldn't sort of think twice about this. It's a little cottage built in 1906, like hundreds of buildings around Brisbane and Queensland for that matter. And yet there is an incredible story with this building that was contested in the Planning Environment Court, and I was an expert witness for the council to prove that actually this house was built before 1911. Now, the first part of it was kind of fairly simple, but I looked at the mortgage, yes, it was built in 1906, no question, and the judge accepted that. But when I looked into the story of who owned the land and who built it, it opened up an extraordinary story, and it was about a woman called Frances Howard. And in those days, if a woman bought a block of land, it was always referred as to so-and-so, the wife of so-and-so. So although it was in her name, a husband was always mentioned. What was interesting is that when I more explored about Frances Howard, she'd owned other property in Manly. And also I found that in the early 1900s, she was actually wheeling and dealing in real estate. Quite extraordinary. And this is a woman, she'd come probably just as a domestic servant to Queensland in the early 1880s, married, had 7 children. 4 of them died in infancy, 2 in stillbirth. Extraordinary. That alone is extraordinary. And so it really, I just thought this was so unusual that a woman like this owned not just one property, but several. And when I was doing research on this, and I talked to someone in the titles office, and I said, look, this must have been exceptionally unusual that a woman owned land. And he said, no, it was common. And it raised this whole extraordinary question to me of that women in Queensland were property owners in the early 20th century, something that no one has ever written about. And it begs for more research. So it really does alter how we might see the role of women in society in Queensland, that they weren't necessarily subservient to their husbands, or even as widows, they owned property. This guy said it was common. So I think just from something simple, that you look at the house and you think nothing of it, it opens all these other little questions, or not little questions, but really significant questions about the role of women in society.
You say it was common, but people didn't know about it then, or we don't think they did, or was it something that was not spoken about?
Not spoken about, obviously. It was just, it was
Frowned
hidden.
upon, though, by some in society?
Who knows? Who knows? No one knows about this. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing. No academic research has looked at this question. You know, they've looked at the role of women and all sorts of other issues, you know, like voting, etc., etc. But this is just absolutely unknown, and it's just totally under the radar screen.
Maybe you'll find some more then.
Oh, no question.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'm sure that you've got plenty of stories to tell us this afternoon. I want to go to you, Margaret, though. You know, there are key memories in our lives and lived experiences that really impact, you know, our lives and our future as well. And the stories we tell of our past, often big things like floods, of course. Everyone can remember where they were, 2011 floods. Everyone's got a story of something like that. Can you tell us about the Brisbane floods and just the impact that had?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing I wanted to share was a flood marker down in Mary Street. So on the side of Nuldum House is a marker of 4 metres, and that's the 2011 flood that we all remember and we think it was extraordinary. And then you look above that and there's the 5 metre mark, and that's the 74 floods that I can remember.
Yeah.
And then you look way, way above your head and there's the 1893 floods, and that's 8 metres. And then if you go to the Indigenous record, the Aboriginal stories tell you of even bigger floods. The 1841 flood was larger, and then there's floods before that. So we think of the 2011 as the big one. But if you look at our past history, it actually shows that there's been lots of them. And there'll be floods again. But this is hidden away. You walk past it. I've walked past it lots of times and not noticed it. It's hidden. And our hidden heritage is actually really interesting. You can find these little snippets that's just a few marks on a wall, and out comes that huge story that has impacted on so many of our lives.
Well, we're seeing a similar thing now, aren't we, with coronavirus and the Spanish flu?
Yeah.
People are going back there comparing what happened in Brisbane to what's been happening with COVID.
And I think it's really interesting in times of crisis that we do look at our history and we look back on past experiences. And maybe we're seeking comfort or knowledge or understanding, I don't know, or just to try to make sense of our life. As you were saying before, your curiosity, has this happened before? What did we learn last time? And I think that's the value of history as well.
Well, someone was saying too about the shops being closed and things like that during this COVID time. But then I go back to thinking, well, people have been through the war. I wonder what those war years were like, you know, early on. And, you know, First World War, Second World War, people, you know, watching and listening might have experiences that they know from their parents, you know, grandparents. But, yeah, every generation has something, I think.
And the Depression as well, that's another story.
Well, I was just going to add, how did Creek Street get its name? A lot of people wouldn't know that there was actually running creek underneath a lot of the buildings and roads here. I didn't know that. I was at a nightclub in Adelaide Street going back a few years. I'm not that old. But I was at a nightclub and this owner of the club says to me, he's banging on the dance floor, he says, do you know under here there's running water? And I was like looking at him. I said, oh, okay. And literally he said he was probably about 65 then. He said I was a 15-year-old doing my apprenticeship when this building was being built, and I literally saw the water running from my own eyes. Then I was speaking to some of the traditional owners here in Brisbane, and they spoke about Creek Street and that fresh water running and how they used to meet up around Roma Street, and that was a place of gathering. So it's really interesting that even some of our streets, Creek Street, you know, a lot of people wouldn't even know how did Creek Street get its name.
Well, it runs down the creek ran from sort of Roma Street in front of the City Hall, and there was a major drain built in 1860, and then it ran down Adelaide Street into Creek, and when it comes out in the river still, there's a drain. You can actually drive a car up it, it's that big. But the drain, when they built the inner city busway, there was this quite significant drain built in 1860, which had to be demolished and is now in the busway station at Roma Street. So it's all part of it. But yeah, it's been there forever, that creek.
You mentioned the busway. Let's turn to the Cross River Rail, Cameron, because it's your latest project. And as an archaeologist with Cross River Rail, tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Yeah, it was interesting actually because here we are talking about a number of things that I've actually touched on just recently with a lot of the work we have been doing under the Cross River Rail project and the things we've been finding. Talk about creeks being uncovered. That's one of the first things we noticed at Wollongabba. You know, was a series of water holes and was used quite regularly as a water source for the people that lived in that area. And as soon as all that material started coming up from the redevelopment of the GoPrint Centre and the land centre there, the creek that was in the middle of that site started to flow again.
Wow.
It's everywhere. It happens all the time. And you know, we're a stone's throw away where we're sitting at the moment from a lot of the Cross River Rail activity here in the city, and in an area that was once historically called Old Frogs Hollow for a reason, because it was, you know, not the nicest part of Brisbane at the time, very low lying and quite wet.
Yes, I know people who love that story. Can you go a little bit more into it, Frogs Hollow, for us?
Well, I mean, the name is referenced as being related to the sounds basically that came from the swamp that was here, being, you know, frogs croaking because of it was so wet. And it's just a low-lying part of Brisbane that's gradually been built up over time, and we've got the modern CBD that sits over the top of it. But during the work, during Cross River Rail, you know, it was quite obvious that there's quite a lot of sediment that's built up here over time. A lot of material's been brought in here over time as well. But there's quite clear, distinct accumulation of material from the flood events that have occurred in Brisbane's just modern history, let alone its ancient history as well.
Yeah, tell us some of the other things that you've found while, you know, working with the Cross River Rail, the interesting digs.
Yeah, well, we've had the opportunity to work on a few interesting sites for many reasons in Brisbane's recent past. One being Wollongabba itself. So, like I said, it was an early water reserve for the people of South Brisbane. And then, of course, you know, a nice gully, good place to dump your garbage, so it became a garbage dump. And then after that, it became part of the rail yards. And then, you know, it expanded eventually to become that land centre development that's just only recently been knocked down. So it's had quite an interesting past. But as we were doing the works underneath the land centre, you know, not as it certainly wasn't something that we really expected to find, but we actually did find quite a lot of remnants of the old rail yards, including footings for the old railway turntable that was part of that depot, and a few other pieces of industrial equipment. As you can imagine, a hell of a lot of abandoned rails from the rail yards, and quite a lot of, you know, rubbish associated with that the early domestic occupation of that part of South Brisbane as well.
When you do find something like that, you know, something from the rail yards or anything, then what's the process? How do you go about then finding out its story?
Oh, there's a very long process around that. A lot of it is luck as well. A lot of the material that we actually do uncover through a lot of this archaeological activity, it's not necessarily something you're going to find a direct record somewhere to tell you the complete story. So
is that where Tom comes in?
No, well, the historical documentation tells you a lot, and often the archaeology can confirm that, but often it actually is in complete contradiction to what the documentary record talks about. The area here in Albert Street in particular, most people probably don't know, historically it was one of the earliest concentrations of Chinese people that were in Queensland during the late 19th century. And for various reasons, when you think about it logically, they were living right next door to the major commercial centre of Brisbane, and it was the hub of industrial activity in Brisbane, and you had the river and the port facilities. Really great place to live and develop a business. Yeah. So they were living in this part of Brisbane. It's quite described in the media as an area of vice and a bit of a slum, so there's a lot of illicit activity going on, not a very nice part of the city to live in. However, when you actually look at the archaeology, it's sure, they're there, that there's evidence of that vice, there's evidence of smoking of opium, there's lots of Chinese coins, there's lots of pottery and ceramics that are associated with Chinese, what you would expect. But there's also a very high mix of material from Great Britain, and evidence that, you know, not only were the Chinese adopting, you know, British ways of life, but there was also quite likely a high proportion of non-Chinese people living in this area. So the archaeology tells a good story, not just about the obvious, but also a lot about that hidden history that the documentary records don't necessarily allow us to see.
And a lot of people, Margaret, like to look back into their hidden history, don't they? When you talk about people who came here before us, they're, part of their family. Do you find that too in your work?
Oh yeah, one of the things that's become incredibly popular is genealogy. And if you go to any archives or libraries, they are full of people doing their family history, and it's just become the thing, hasn't it? It doesn't matter what race, where you come from, how long you've been in Australia or anything. The commonality is they want to know about their families.
Yeah. How much can they actually find out?
It is actually incredible what they can find out. There's shipping records, you can find births, deaths, marriages, the newspapers, there's so much more online. It's incredible, the detail. It's again, curiosity and the questions you ask.
And through the archaeology, you can also work out how much they were drinking and what they were drinking as well.
I think it's interesting to say that the great game changer in history and archaeology is the access to newspapers online now. That is an utter game changer in so many ways. It really has revolutionised history, and I don't think history's quite woken up to it, how revolutionary it is. It's just quite extraordinary the things you can find. But just getting back to Cameron's point, I think what's really interesting about what they've found is that and this is a good example of where archaeology really comes to the fore, is that people, you could look at all the documents ad nauseum of Brisbane in the 19th century, but it's how people are looking at the documents, and they will always overlook. I mean, there'll be a stack of stuff in the documents about the Chinese, but no one, you ignore them. It's ignored. Think, oh, well, they didn't really. But it's only when you actually uncover the stuff does the penny drop.
Yeah,
and
it points you back to it.
Yeah, and that's the value of it, because people are always overlooking and not seeing things in history all the time. I mean, they did it with Aboriginal people for a start, but I mean, and then all of the thing, suddenly,
Yes.
So that's, I think, some of the differences. And again, it gets back to this curiosity and keeping your eyes open.
Yeah, and Minjerribah, would you like to pick up there about, the things that have been hidden from us?
Yeah, well, I was just curious with the opium, the little utensil.
The opium pick. Yep.
Was it the opium pick? I've never heard of an opium pick. But just recently I interviewed Dr. Fiona Foley for a podcast that I do, and Dr. Fiona Foley has just launched a book yesterday called Biting the Clouds. She also has a book called Black Opium. And at the State Library, as part of our cultural tours, walking tours, history tours, truth-telling tours, whatever you want to call it, black card tours kind of take people around Brisbane, South Brisbane, over then to the city, and we activate public Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art. So, art is a draw card, especially for international tourists, right? But then domestically, and for Brisbaneites, for them to actually get a new perspective of Brisbane, the city that they live in, the city that they know really well, they thought they knew. In the State Library, up on level 4, you're talking about genealogies and people going to the library. I'm in the library a lot, taking people through Fiona Foley's installation there, which is about the Opium Act and the opium trade. So up on the ceiling of level 4, there's this infinity symbol of opium poppies that are suspended from the ceiling, metal poppies, and there's 7 booths that are connected to that major installation that talks about Queensland's history. The restriction of the sale of opium and the Protection of Aborigines Act 1897, where opium was widespread in terms of the use of opium, but also the payment to Aboriginal people for a hard day's work. They were paid in the form of opium, but it wasn't proper opium. It was actually the ashes of opium. So they're working their butts off, and here they are getting some black ash, right? The ash of opium. And what they did with the opium is they put in a little bit of water, and they would literally stir that around in their little cup or bottle, and they would drink that and still get the same impact or feeling of being under the influence of opium.
Get addicted to it.
What a great way to get your workforce to turn up to work tomorrow. Yeah. Get them hooked on opium. Yeah. But in the State Library, you look at one of the study booths, you know, there's people in there studying every day. I don't think they actually know what's on the wall. In one of the booths, it's got every single town in Queensland and how many opium licences were issued by the state of Queensland. There was opium dens right across Queensland and they were selling opium. So it was widespread throughout those days, especially in North Queensland. But the fact that they were paying Aboriginal people that were under the Aboriginal Protection Act, working out on cattle stations and properties, they were paying them in the form of opium is just, for me, I kind of think, how come we don't know about this? They took the Chinese out of business. You know, it was the largest form of revenue at the time for the state of Queensland was the sale of opium licences. Yeah, so I think it is really important that we understand our history, the good and the bad, not just the parts that make us feel good.
And when you talk about addiction and problems that we're seeing, it started back there. It sort of set a precedent, didn't it? Yeah.
It definitely started back there, but it's really good that Fiona Foley's been really brave, right, and putting these art installations in, hopefully, in people's view, like as people walking past. At the back of the courthouse, looking at Roma Street Parklands, she's got another installation there, and that refers to the 97 massacre sites in the state of Queensland. So when we're talking about history, and talking about opium and talking about Aboriginal people living on reserves and whatever, what about the 97 massacre sites? And that's interesting because Fiona was saying that people are walking past this installation every day and it's got these big kind of stakes coming out of the ground, and on the stakes is this black ash. And first she kind of told people, she lied. She told people that it had to do with the floods and the natural disasters and the bushfires. And it was actually the ashes of all the bodies that they burnt after they had massacred a whole lot of Aboriginal people to hide what they did. So right there behind the courthouse in the cement, it's etched into the cement, every town where a massacre, every place where a massacre occurred in Queensland. So I just want to say it's really good to have people like Dr. Fiona Foley, who's using art as a platform, right, as a way to remind us of our history, but also just for everyday Brisbane people, Queenslanders, to appreciate our history as well.
And to be told that history that many, many people don't know about and wouldn't know that that's there, and if they're looking at it, wouldn't know what it represented. Tom, I know that you want to talk about another immigrant story that you have here in Brisbane. We've heard about the Chinese, we've heard about, we hear about Irish and Scottish and British, but you've got somebody else.
Yeah, this is a church actually at South Brisbane. It's now called the Serbian Orthodox Church. And there's two kind of interesting things about this. It was actually built as a congregational church in the 1930s. And then it got sold, and the Serbian congregation, as you can see from the photo, have kind of done a makeover. And it more represents a fairly typical Orthodox church. So it says one thing about immigrant communities, and actually South Brisbane's very interesting. It's not the only evidence of this. There's two Russian Orthodox churches in South Brisbane. There is, would you believe, a Russian Baptist church, and it's still standing, but it's a house now. And I'd recently discovered a Russian Seventh-day Adventist church. So it shows this and that's only touching the surface in a sense. But what I find remarkable about this church, if you poke your head over the fence, and it's not easy, and if you look at the foundation stone, I've got to read this, and it says the Free Serbian Orthodox Memorial Church, dedicated to the memory of Serbian heroic defenders of the faith and fighters for the freedom of the Serbian nation who gave their lives in the Kozio-Poljo battle. Now, ask you, what date would you put on that? That's represented and it's actually the 28th of June, 1389. and then battles up to the present. So I think it's interesting is that, like, I guess for Anglos, I mean, if you're Scottish, you might remember the Battle of Culloden and whatever. But for we've got this memory in Brisbane of a battle going back to 1389.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's there sort of in your face. Well, I was going to say in your face. It's over the fence, but it's in your face. So I guess it just indicates the richness of our communities. I mean, the Serbian community is, in a sense, is small, but nevertheless significant. And I think, that's something we need to kind of remember and commemorate even more, the diversity that's there and the contributions that Serbian people have made to our community. So it's just another little thing that's there that reminds us, that's in our heritage, it's there.
Yeah, and that diversity, of course, is increasing, isn't it, as we go on? What are we going to look at in 50 years' time? Do you think the makeup will be of Queensland?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's actually interesting. I mean, it just seems a bit of if you look at, say, churches in particular, I mean, just how diverse they have been. I mean, I just mentioned a couple, but it is quite extraordinary just how diverse. And not just churches, but temples, etc., etc. I mean, there was a significant number of Chinese temples in Queensland in the 19th century. I think something like 17. I mean, probably only 2 survived, but who'd ever thought, there was at least 17 Chinese temples throughout, and in places that you would not have imagined, like I think Gundawindi, for example, So, again, it's that richness that's there.
I've got another site that I was going to mention, which is the pylons. There's the remnants, the ruin of the Victoria Bridge, which was washed away in the floods. But the reason I mention it now is because it's got a plaque on it that represents the Greek community, which is also a big part of South Brisbane.
Yeah, I forgot.
And there's a young boy, a Greek boy who was 11, who was watching at the end of World War I the soldiers coming back, and he got run over by one of the carriages in the parade. And that plaque is there. And when they restored the pylon, they put the plaque back. It's got a photo of his face. And every year the Greeks celebrate or commemorate Anzac Day at that site. So that's the Greek community. And it's not in a church and it's not in a Greek restaurant as we might think. It's hidden in a ruin tucked away near the State Library.
Yeah, and gee, that's such a powerful story, isn't it? Such a sad story for them at that time.
Yeah.
But they're still remembering it. What about the Story Bridge? And that that recently celebrated its 80th birthday.
Yeah.
That's been a very important part of our history.
Yeah, well, it was built in 1940, and it's part of the story of the use of the Brisbane River as well, because it was about not being able to bring the big vessels upstream, so they had to build a bigger bridge so that they could build a port further downstream. So yeah, and the story with the Victoria Bridge is that was the only river crossing for a long, long time. The first one was in 1865 and it got eaten by borers because it was a wooden bridge. Then the next one got washed away by the 1893 floods, and then they had the 1896 floods that washed the next one away, and then that one. And then for a long time, until the 1930s, that was the main bridge to get across from the north side to the south side. And it marked the demise of the south side after those floods, and people moved north. And so then they start building these other bridges like the Story Bridge and Grey Street Bridge and so on.
I was just going to add to that. I'm not too sure if I'm correct or not, so maybe correct me if I'm wrong. So the war happened in 1940. Around 1940 there was a war on.
Yep.
And some of my old people talk about how all of the men went to fight in the war. And here in Queensland, buildings needed to be built, roads needed to be built, bridges needed to be built. Where was the workforce? Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people built the infrastructure of the state of Queensland around the 1940s, and their wages were withheld from them. So not only was the infrastructure and they were labour, but they weren't paid for their labour. The money went into a Queensland Government trust fund, and there's records there with Dr Ros Kidd's work. Every single transaction from Queensland Government departments using the stolen wages as a slush fund, there's evidence that clearly suggests from Dr Ros Kidd's work that the Redcliffe Hospital was built with the stolen wages. Mm-hmm. So my dad used to wear a T-shirt. His name was Tiger Bales. He used to wear a T-shirt and it said "Stolen wages built this state," and it was a Queensland it was a Queensland map. And I never understood that as a young person growing up. What did stolen wages build this state? What did that T-shirt mean? But every time he wore it, I realised people looked at him. It's like walking around Brisbane with "always was, always will be" T-shirt. People look at you and they read it and they look at you again. And my husband always says to me, "Why did you have to wear that shirt to lunch? Why didn't you get dressed?" But it's just interesting that my dad used to wear a T-shirt that I had no knowledge of it. And as now I'm a bit older, I have now started to look at Dr. Roskid's work. And basically she's saying that, the Queensland government basically had tens of thousands of Aboriginal people that were living on reserves up until the 1970s. Aboriginal people that were under that Protection Act, right, the Restriction of the Sale of Opium, Protection of Aborigines Act, they were like wards of the state. So they were owned by the government. Every aspect of their lives was controlled by the state. So where they worked, where they lived, who they could marry, and whether they could receive their wages. So I think that's really important to understand that legislation, right, was in place until the 1970s. In the 1950s, Albert Namatjira, we're going to the Northern Territory now, but this is really important in terms of history. Albert Namatjira has an amazing collection or an exhibition at the Art Gallery at the moment. His grandson, Vincent Namatjira, who won an Archibald Prize recently, first Aboriginal person to win one. Anyhow, the Namatjira story is basically that he became the first partial citizen, Aboriginal citizen, in the 1940s or 50s. And the only reason why the Australian government gave him partial citizenship is so they could tax the sale of his art. Now, Namatjira asked to buy property with his citizenship and they said no, Aboriginal people can't own property. Then he went to buy a pastoral station and they said no, Aboriginal people can't own businesses. But he said, no, I've got my piece of paper, it meant nothing. This poor man, Mr. Namatjira, right, held in high regard, very well-known artist. When he died, the Australian government sold the copyright. His wife didn't inherit, or his children didn't inherit his copyright to all of his art. The Australian government sold it to someone overseas. An amazing Australian man, is it Dick Smith?
Yep.
Dick Smith, he actually fought for the Namatjira family. And there's a documentary, the Namatjira documentary, and Dick Smith, I'm pretty sure, paid $1 million. Now, these are the stories that we tell on a walking tour around Brisbane when we go into the art gallery and we're looking at this amazing exhibition of all of his amazing landscape watercolour paintings. And then all of a sudden we start to talk about his family and his story. So Dick Smith bought the copyright for $1 million and sold it back to the Namatjira family for $1.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That was in 2016. So look at all of this time that's passed and that family has never benefited from the sale of any of his artworks or the copyright.
Amazing story, yeah, and they are the stories that you do learn when you go on tours around the city, and seeing these buildings. I'm wondering, and it's a question for all of you, about the buildings of today, and are we protecting our past at the moment? Who's game to answer that? Cameron?
The ex-government employee. Look, I think we are, but I think maybe people's understanding of what is our heritage, is really the key question here, because it doesn't have to be old, it doesn't necessarily need to be beautiful. It just needs to inspire something in our psyche, effectively. So what's local to me is probably quite, and important, is quite different to Tom, and it's quite different to Mundanar, and it's quite different to Margaret. So to me, the protection is there, it's available, it's possible. And we're only recently starting to see a lot of modern, what we would consider more modern places coming to the fore in terms of, oh yeah, actually that is something that is important to us. That is something that we should be protecting. And I think that's really exciting. I think a lot more modern places should be brought forward for protection, not just those things that we see in our imagination as heritage, your older timber and tin cottages and your amazing grand houses of the late 19th century.
Yeah.
So Yeah,
Has the Queenslander home changed? Is it still the thing?
I certainly live in a Queenslander myself.
Because it really
hasn't changed much.
It identifies us, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. I mean, it is. There's no question that there is something quite distinctive about houses generally in Queensland, and part of that's to do with a couple of things. I mean, it's quite interesting how one piece of legislation can be quite dramatic. In 1885, there was this very small Act of Parliament. It was about 3 pages, and it was called the Prevention of Undue Subdivision of Land Act. Big mouthful. It's like, these acts. But what it was about was that there was a great issue in the 1880s about overcrowding in cities and terraced houses. So Queensland said, no, we're going to do away with terrace houses. And the way they did it was just had this legislation is that the minimum block of land you could have was 16 perches or 400 square metres. So what that meant was you couldn't build terraced houses, or it was very difficult. So in the stroke of a pen throughout Queensland, we had detached houses. Really simple. It just changed Queensland. And so the first thing is that all our housing there was no terraced houses anywhere. I mean, it's ironic. You go into New South Wales, in Western Queensland, in Burke, for goodness sake, in the Western, where land's not sort of desperate, but they have terraced housing in Burke. None of that in Queensland. The second thing is we had an extraordinary, well, almost still have, an extraordinary abundance of timber, and good timber for building. I mean, we're just exceptional. And so housing was really cheap. And so that kind of formed the way, and it was true on Aboriginal reserves as well. They were the same, all bit smaller, much smaller houses, but it was the same everywhere. We had timber houses with kind of variations of things. Timber housing, corrugated iron roofs, and often high set, but that there's a bit of a variation in that, but pretty similar. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing. Wherever you go in Queensland, they're kind of all the same almost. But important. I mean, unfortunately, what's happening in some parts of Brisbane, I mean, these houses are being done to death, and there's obscene sort of policies. You can raise it up to 9.5 metres. I mean, I find just utterly incomprehensible that that's happening, and just defeats the whole purpose of these houses.
Yeah. You wonder, what we want now when we have a house. What is it that we're looking for? Is it a statement piece, or is it a home, You wanted to say?
Well, the thing with the Queenslanders is they're incredibly adaptable. You can move them, you can extend them, you can modify them. But that's also their downfall, because we're moving them on the block and putting an extra one in and changing the character. So that suburban block that we've treasured with our, Hills Hoist and our mango tree is going to be a thing of the past because of urban density. So we have to think about what we want our city to be like. It's going to grow. It's going to probably double in size. So we've got to manage that. And maybe we think about different areas that are high rise and so on, and leave the character alone.
I was going to say, well, I'm moving to Mount Coolum. 3 weeks counting down to get out of Brisbane and do a sea change. But it's interesting because I was looking for houses here in Brisbane. I live at Cannon Hill, and I was going to all these house inspections, right? My husband was booking them all in because he's the stay-at-home dad looking after 5 children. That's why, with all the COVID and all the toilet paper we were talking about earlier, my husband went stupid. But anyhow, he was looking for houses, and he was not telling me the price of them. So I'm turning up to these house inspections in like Carindale, and I'm like, these were mansions. And I was saying to my husband as we're walking in, I'm looking at him going, how much is this? He goes, oh, don't worry, sweetie. And I'm like, well, am I wasting my time? Anyhow, I'm talking to the real estate guy, and I'm like, so how much is this? Oh, yeah, it's 3.5. And I'm like, 3.5 million? And he goes, yeah. And I looked at my husband, I'm like, what are we doing here? We're under $1 million. We can't afford to buy a house in this suburb. So we started looking at the Sunshine Coast. But it was interesting because I said to my husband, what kind of house do you want to live in? He wanted to live in a Queenslander, and I wanted something that was more of a statement piece. And we had to compromise. So that was interesting, that we never ever thought of what kind of house we wanted to live in until it came to buying a house. He loved the Queenslanders and I didn't. I come from Sydney, by the way, and I was used to living in sardines, like those terrace houses. Getting out of Sydney, coming to Brisbane, you do appreciate space.
Yes, that's right, the wide open spaces. When we talk about history and finding out about people and where we live, a great place to do it is in a cemetery. Have you walked around a cemetery and seen the years on those graves and the stories that you can learn? Margaret, you would have looked at, not that you spend a lot of time in cemeteries, but you would have...
I probably do.
Probably do.
They're a great place to take school children because they are full of stories. Yeah. And you can go, and probably particularly topical at the moment, because you take them through and show them that we used to die of diphtheria and cholera and typhoid and all of those things that we take for granted that we don't anymore. And you see people who've died from mining accidents or drownings and so on. And so you get an insight into what life was like before. So they're really good. And that's before we even get to the iconography and the architecture and the religious elements that we were talking about before. They're an absolute smorgasbord of history, really. There's so many stories you can tell.
Yeah, they definitely are. I mean, you would have...
Yeah, but again, it's the hidden things where you don't see... just getting back to stillbirths or early infancy. You know, often this woman I talked about before, you know, she lost 4 children. She was living at Annerley, and the 4 children are buried in South Brisbane, but there's no grave. She simply couldn't afford it. And, you know, I mean, more tragically, if we go to a place like Cherbourg, Aboriginal settlement, that talking about pandemics, in 1919... 20% of the population died of the Spanish flu. It was the highest rate of mortality in Australia, 20%. And of course, people were buried in mass graves there and all unmarked, although they have recently discovered actually where those burials occurred. So again, you know, cemeteries can be a bit deceptive because the real stories are still hidden, and really tragic stories.
There's always a family member somewhere you can find, isn't there, if you dig hard enough to find that story? And I'm sure, Margaret, you and Tom, you would have maybe looked for people to tell the story to you?
Well, this is where Tom was talking about the newspapers that are online now. They are a treat, and then you get names and you can start following those through records. And then you do oral history and you actually find the families and get the stories, and that's when you get the richness really coming through.
Have you done your own?
Yeah, luckily my father had done most of it, so yeah, I have it.
What can you tell us?
Well, it's not particularly exciting. It's probably the traditional 5th generation coming out on the ship type story, and he's got his great-great-grandfather's diary, so that's quite interesting. They're from Scotland and they came out, so it's a fairly predictable story, I'm afraid.
We have a lot of, war history as well, and of course when you walk around Brisbane and you see some air raid shelters that are now made into little coffee hubs. I know my mother tells me about being at school and having to run out into the grounds to the air raid shelter doing a drill. Do we know where they all are?
Yeah, we do probably.
How many are there?
Lots.
That we know of?
Lots. Well, I guess there's 2 categories. Well, probably more than 2 categories. There's quite a significant number that remain that were public air raid shelters. I mean, in parks and all around Brisbane. I mean, and if you know what they're like, they're pretty distinguishable. Then there's ones that are actually kind of semi-hidden in car parks. Well, there's one I know someone pointed out in a building at Greenslopes in the car park of this set of flats. I know there's one at Ashgrove in someone's backyard or side yard, a small one, and numbers of buildings had them built at the back. Possibly one of the most interesting air raid shelters was built in a building that's now demolished, which was the police station at Roma Street. Because obviously when the war started to really happen, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, the government decided in the basement of the police station to build a command centre for obviously, the local command, so that was the Minister for Home Affairs and whatever. So they reinforced all these walls in the basement of the police station. The building was mainly demolished in the late 1960s, but they didn't ever demolish this basement because it had all this reinforced concrete wall. And it was only with building of the inner city busway that this was all discovered. And it was amazing what was intact. I mean, they even had these little holes between one room to the other where they'd put bricks in, just loose bricks, so that if you had to escape from one room to the other, the bricks were still in place, literally.
Yeah. And Cameron, you must have just a mountain of stuff that you still haven't found yet with this Cross River Rail project.
Well, there's still work ongoing, that's certainly for sure. And, we have come across everything from local residents' backyard rubbish to the remains of what was obviously a bootmaker's small business at some point to, the old pub that used to be on the corner just down the road here on the corner of Albert Street. There's still a little bit more to go. We'll never know what we won't find until the time comes.
Yeah. For people who do want to know more about the history, I mean, what's your advice to them?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I know we're certainly working towards some kind of public exhibition display. There's already a lot of information that's already on public display with the Experience Centre for Cross River Rail here in the city. One of the exciting things I think about the archaeological record as well is that we've been talking a bit about education, and it's a fantastic educational tool. And one of the things that we're quite passionate about is actually making sure that some of this material does get that additional research, it does get that additional investigation. It gives a whole new generation, effectively, of archaeologists and probably historians as well, an opportunity to start asking some new questions about Brisbane's history that may never have been asked if this work hadn't actually happened. So, we're pretty excited about that. We've already got people lined up through the university system that are going to start looking at some of this material in the next few years, and it'll be really exciting to see some of that come out into the public sphere too.
Margaret, why is it important that we should really delve into our own history?
Our personal history? Or
both, I think.
I think people have a sense of being... I think it makes you realise you're more important than you're just yourself. I think you can become really selfish and self-centred, and I think it's very important to realise that there's thousands of years of history in this country and you're just a little drop. And even in your own family, you're just one piece. I mean, I think of history as a jigsaw. I always have. And you go and look for that little piece. It's the jigsaw puzzle that you're putting together. And each one of us will have different pieces that we can put in that. You'll probably never get the whole puzzle solved, as you say. You can always keep looking or find another puzzle. But to me, it brings a richness to your life. When you look around you with some historical context, I do think you see the world better. I think you make better decisions and you're a better citizen, perhaps. That's my aspiration anyway.
What do you think people looking at 2020 in 50, 100 years, sitting around like this, I don't know how they'll be talking, probably not with a microphone, I don't know what they'll be doing, reading each other's minds. What will they be saying about us in 2020?
They'll be talking about COVID. I can almost guarantee that, because that is our watershed moment for this generation. Just as we're talking about wars and depressions and so on, they will be talking about COVID in 50 years, because I think it's a really big game changer. I thought it would be the moment that we would change the world in a positive way. I'm not quite as convinced we will, but I think that will be what we'll be talking about. As for what technology we have, I mean, we've probably seen more changes in this generation than before, but every generation thinks they're new and exciting and things have not happened before them. I still think the printing press was one of the best things that's ever happened, much less an Apple iPhone. So I don't know what we'll be thinking, but I can pretty much guarantee that we'll be talking about COVID.
Yeah, I'll get an answer from each of you. What do you think, Cameron, people will be talking about?
I'll speak as an archaeologist and think that COVID's going to change the way that we have been living, and it already has, and there will be long-term effects to that, and it will affect the material culture that we are now leaving, because we are constantly creating a new archaeological record. So the archaeologist of the future is going to see, I think, a a sharp change in the consumption of the materials that we're using and utilising. There's certainly going to be a hell of a lot of face masks and things like that in the archaeological record.
Definitely.
But there will be a noticeable shift in patterns of consumption, and I think the future archaeologists might be able to see that.
Mandanara, what about for you?
I just can't help but think that, this is the oldest living, or Aboriginal culture is the oldest living culture in world history, and the fact that in 250 years we've kind of wrecked the place. How are we going to have the next generation grow up and actually look after this country? To ensure that our history stretches as far in front of us as it does behind us. I don't know what kind of generation's coming through, but I just hope that they start to really think about looking after the planet so that our future generations inherit a healthy planet, clean water and clean air. That's what I hope they're thinking about. They're not thinking about, they're doing it.
Yeah. And Tom, what will they be talking about?
I'd agree. I think the COVID call is too early. I think we're so locked into it. I want some distance. But I think that's the great challenge. I met this grazier out at Wandowan, and he was researching the 150 years history, and he says, we're going to own this property for another 150 years. That's how long thinking he was, but we need to think even longer. And we ain't doing too well at it. How much we've wrecked it, you could say, in the last 50 years or 20 years. We've done a good, and we really have not woken up to the fact that we're consuming too much. We're absolutely destroying this planet so rapidly, and that's the real challenge. And the thing about history, and when in the long term, the global history, we think, people looked after this place for a long time, carefully. Yeah, that's the challenge.
Yeah, that's the challenge, and that's the message. Keep looking after this wonderful planet, and you never know what you might find, what is lurking beneath all the wonderful stories. And let's hope they're going to be talking about us too. Thank you so much to the wonderful panel, Tom, Mandanara, Cameron and Margaret. It's been great to have a conversation with you today. That's our final panel discussion for Brisbane Open Houses series, and loving our local heritage. And please keep loving it. Bye for now.